This setting on your camera might be holding you back from getting sharp photos. And that setting is shutter speed, a topic that is heavily neglected a lot in photo tutorials because most beginners only chase for that blurry background, aka the bokeh, which is controlled by aperture. And I mean, who can blame them, right? I'm still a sucker for those creamy, melty, juicy background blur. However, I would argue that shutter speed is the one setting that gives us the most creative control that produces the most interesting results. Not only is it a vital setting to get sharp photos, but we can also use it to achieve powerful effects, like smoothing out waterfalls, getting light trails in cityscapes, and conveying the sense of motion from moving objects. Really good. So in this video, we're gonna break down everything that you need to know about shutter speed, some rules on how to actually get sharp photos through some recommended settings, and then we're gonna break those rules to achieve some creative photos that you can start doing today. But first, what the hell is shutter speed? Fundamentals. So here's the textbook definition. Shutter speed is the duration of time that the camera's shutter is open to allow light to hit into the sensor. That's a bit hard to understand, so here's an incredibly dumbed down version. Shutter speed determines how fast the camera captures the photo. It is measured by 1 second, so this number here is a fraction of that 1 second. 1/8000 is considered super fast, 1/800 is considered fast, 1/80th is considered normal, 1/8 is considered slow, and 8 seconds is considered super slow because then it's literally 8 seconds for your camera to spit you back out an image. So accidentally using a slower shutter speed is the root cause of why our photos end up being blurry. Here's a great demonstration that you may have seen from my other videos, but it clearly demonstrates how fast and slow shutter speed can affect the outcome of your photo. So watch as I'm dialing the shutter speed to the left here. As you can see, there's a lot more blur happening as we go down in number to the point where I'm becoming a slow moving ghost. Taking a photo here will result in a blurry photo. Vice versa, as we dial it to the right, there's less and less blur to the point where you can pause the frame at any second and see that I'm frozen in action. And that's the thing that you need to keep in mind when you want sharp photos.
Photographing static subjects.
Photographing static subjects like landscape, cityscape, product, or still portraitures is relatively easy. Just follow this general rule of thumb for handheld photography. If you're using a camera and a lens without any built-in image stabilization, for full-frame users, shoot at your focal length. So if you're using a 50mm, then your shutter speed should be at least 1/50. If you're an APS-C user, double your focal length. If you're using a 50mm, then your shutter speed should be at least 1/100. Now, if you're using a zoom lens, set your shutter speed to match or double your maximum focal length, so you don't have to constantly keep changing it every time you zoom in and out. But keep in mind, this is just a baseline recommendation, and we're going to be building on top of this as we move forward. However, if you have image stabilization on either the body or the lens, then you can go under this recommendation here, and I'll show you examples on why this would be beneficial in a bit.
Photographing moving subjects.
Now, pet and kids photography are probably some of the more challenging photographic genre, in my Vong opinion. By the way, that's my last name. My name is Jason Vong.
The Vong is never wrong.
And like raising pets and kids, it takes quite a bit of trial and error. For our demonstration here, we'll be doing some cat photography. And the setup that I'll be using is a full frame camera with a 50mm lens. Here's an example of me using a slow shutter speed. Not so good, as our lovely cat here is walking quite briskly. And here's an example of me using the recommended shutter speed that we talked about earlier. And yeah, we got a few good ones, but the few that are in between are quite blurry. And finally, here's me pushing past the recommended shutter speed by a bit, and I'm finally getting crystal clear results consistently. Going a little above the recommended shutter speed for moving subjects puts us at a peace of mind that we're getting sharp photos. It's what event and wedding photographers would do on a fast-paced day without having to think about settings too much. On that note,
Is there such a thing as too high of a shutter speed?
if we're speaking strictly for static to slow-moving subjects, as long as you're not drastically sacrificing image quality, then you don't need to worry. But what do I mean by that? Sacrificing image quality. How is that even possible? Going back to our textbook definition, this is where the light gathering into the sensor comes into play. Don't tell the other photography YouTube channels this, but let me illustrate this to you with a faucet and a cup. The water here from the faucet represents light, and the cup here represents the sensor of the camera. A fast shutter speed is us quickly turning on and off the faucet, and because of that, only a little bit of the water is stored in the cup. Versus a slow shutter speed, it's kind of like letting the faucet run. The longer it runs, the more water is captured. So as you can imagine, the faster the shutter, the less light is gathered. That's why you'll notice as we run our shutter to the right, the image gets darker. Shutter speed is one of the 3 settings on our camera that controls the overall exposure, and we would compensate the change in brightness with either the aperture or the ISO. And it's usually going to be the ISO that we would use to get our image back to correct exposure. But if we increase our ISO too much, then we would get a noisy, grainy photo, and that sometimes is undesirable. Vice versa, when we run our shutter to the left, we're giving more time for the light to enter the sensor. And when we have more light coming in, there's no need to run our ISO too high. So to answer the question, is there such a thing as too high of a shutter speed? If your shot of a static building was 1/8000 and your ISO is just 100, your photo doesn't have any visible noise and it's conveying what you need it to convey, then you're fine. However, if your shot of the same static building was 1/8000 and your ISO is at 409,600, then yeah, you can come down on your shutter. Now obviously, these are just very exaggerated examples, but I bring this up because I've seen photographers who share their settings for some of their photos on social media, and other photographers harshly judge them for not using the ideal settings. But at the end of the day, your friends, your family, and most importantly, your paying clients won't care what settings you use as long as you get them amazing results.
Photographing fast action.
So now let's actually talk about using fast shutter speed, and this will be for high action scenarios like sports and wildlife. So if things are moving fairly quickly and you can keep up with it, you can try 1/250 or 1/500. But if things are racing past you and they have the potential of leaving your frame really quickly, then you can try 1/1000, 1/2000, or even 1/4000. Again, same advice, get a few clicks in, review the photos, and make adjustments if necessary. However, if it's unpredictable, start as high as you can so long as you have your aperture and ISO settings in check. In fact, I would use auto ISO and keep my max ISO around 6400 for unpredictable lighting situations, especially for concerts. But don't be afraid to push into higher ISO territories like 12,800 or even 25,600. For some scenarios such as sports or even wedding photography, if the lighting cannot be controlled and you're forced into an unideal lighting situation, then it's always best to get the clearest shot that you can. At the end of the day, getting the critical moment sharp and in focus is far more important than seeing noise. And some of my viewers have made a note in my previous videos that Adobe Lightroom has a great denoise feature that works incredibly well.
Slow shutter speed.
And now, let's break the rules and talk about when we should use slow shutter speed. Using a slow shutter speed is actually very beneficial in low light situations. Remember, the slower the shutter speed, the longer it takes for the camera to gather in more light to take the photo. And we can use this trick to keep our ISO setting low, thus minimizing the noise in our photos. Take a look at these two photos here. One shot at ISO 100 and the other at ISO 640. While the ISO 640 isn't considered a high ISO and the shot doesn't look too bad, the noise is a lot more apparent when you compare it to the ISO 100 shot. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the shutter speed for these two shots. I was at 1/40 for the photo on the right. In most cases, 1/40 isn't that fast of a shutter speed. However, because my camera has in-body image stabilization built in, I was able to go down to 1/6 of a second, opening up more time for the light to enter the sensor. And that is why I was able to take this photo on the left at ISO 100. Now you may ask, can we shoot even slower handheld? Oh boy, we are entering some risky territory right here. Again, it would depend if your camera or lens have image stabilization built in. That feature will allow for more flexibility. But if we shoot too slow of a shutter speed handheld, we will inevitably get motion blur in our photos because as humans, we cannot stay completely still. And that is where a tripod comes into play. This will allow us to further open up our shutter to either 30 seconds or indefinitely with bulb mode. Because the camera is locked off on a stable tripod, we never have to worry about the micro jitters from our hands. One tip that I would recommend is to make sure that we enable a 2-second timer on our camera, or use a remote trigger to ensure the camera stays absolutely still the whole time. With a tripod, if we're taking a cityscape shot, we can add some cool light trail effects from passing cars. And if you want an empty shot of a location, this long exposure trick with a tripod is a great way to remove a few stragglers from the shot without having to use generative fill AI in Photoshop, thus keeping your photo as authentic as possible. Well, as long as the stragglers aren't staying completely still while you're taking the photo of the scene, of course. Happened to me a few times, you know, I'm out at this epic location, getting this great shot, but there's this one guy. Bro, get out of the way, I'm trying to get a photo here, dude!
Artistic shutter speed.
But I have to admit, sometimes it's not that bad to have a moving crowd in your shot. Use that to your advantage. An artistic way to go about it, or what some people say, a more positive mindset, is that it helps make your cityscape photos feel more alive. Usually 1/25 or 1/10 is good enough to get a good amount of motion blur from a moving crowd. And this is the same technique that waterfall photographers use to smooth out the water to emphasize the gushing motion. Now, depending on how bright the scene is, like if you're photographing during daytime, you may need to compensate by closing down on your aperture, using the larger number, or using a neutral density filter to help cut down on some of that light. On the flip side, we can use slow shutter speed to emphasize motion from a specific object, like cars, and we call this the panning technique, in which we pan the camera to follow the moving object. Now we have a sharp and clear shot of the moving subject, but the background looks like it's moving. Now, I will say the panning technique, especially in low-light situations, is going to be incredibly difficult to execute, but it feels freaking amazing when you nail it. This video is part 2 of 3 photography settings basics that I'll be covering on this channel. Next time, we'll talk about ISO. But for now, catch up on part 1 aperture along with more fun photography tutorials on my playlist right here. If you like what I'm doing and you want to support the channel, you can drop a one-time super thanks donation right here on the bottom of the screen, or simply stick around and listen to what my sponsor Squarespace has to say. Squarespace is an all-in-one platform to create beautiful websites. You don't need any coding knowledge whatsoever. Simply just choose from their many easy-to-use templates. Perfect for people like us who want to focus on our travels and make YouTube videos for you guys, but still want a presentable website for brands that are looking to work with us. Whether you're building your own photography portfolio, an e-commerce store, or even a landing page for your business, design it with Squarespace. Get a 14-day trial with my link below and try it for yourself. When you're ready to launch, you can save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain with my code JasonVong. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you guys in our next video. Peace.
And recording, go for it.
Oh, here, I'll do this. Actually, I'll do this.
Yeah, just do that.
You ready?
Lift the cup a little higher. Lower. Okay.
Ready?
Mhm.
3, 2, 1.